No one expected a stranger to slip between the stars that summer. The telescopes in Hawaii had been tracing comets for months, mapping slow wanderers across the black. Most moved just as they always did, obedient, predictable, tied to the pull of the sun like planets are tied to their paths. But one evening, inside the chill dome of the Atlas Observatory, a faint speck appeared that refused to behave. At first, it was almost nothing, a streak barely wider than a grain of dust against the digital field. Astronomers blinked, zoomed in, and checked the calibration. It wasn't supposed to be there. The software flagged it, catalogued it automatically. 3I Atlas, the third known interstellar object. The moment that designation appeared, the night shifted. You could almost feel the hush roll through the observatory, as if the air itself paused to listen. Interstellar. That single word carries the quiet weight of eternity. Astronomers leaned closer to their monitors, whispering their surprise as the data began to arrive. The object was faint but real. Its path cut across the sky at an angle that no ordinary comet could take. It wasn't looping from the Oort cloud, nor swinging in from a long-period orbit. Its trajectory was open, hyperbolic. Whatever it was just passing through. For a moment, no one spoke. The hum of the cooling fans, the distant hiss of the telescope motor, those were the only sounds. Then someone broke the silence with a simple, almost childlike question. Where has it come from? It's a question that humans have whispered since we first looked up at the stars. 3I Atlas moved quickly. Each night it grew a little brighter, not because it was approaching the sun like an ordinary comet, but because the light reflecting from its dust was now reaching Earth more clearly. Its color, soft bluish-white, suggested frozen gases sublimating away, a faint tail beginning to glow. News of its discovery spread quietly through the astronomy community. There had been Oumuamua in 2017, that strange cigar-shaped rock that tumbled end over end, and then Borisov in 2019, the first confirmed interstellar comet. But this was something else. Each new image of 3I Atlas brought with it a soft unease. Its coma was oddly shaped, almost layered, like sheets of translucent fabric swirling around a hidden core. It didn't behave the way comets were supposed to behave. Still, there was wonder before there was worry. People love to name what they find, to turn a flicker of light into a story. In the quiet rooms of observatories across the world, scientists compared notes and whispered theories. They spoke of trajectories and reflectivity, of angles of approach and possible origins. Perhaps it had been flung out of a young star system long before our own Earth cooled. Maybe it was the remnant of some ancient collision. For those who watched it, there was something intimate about its path. It wasn't just a dot on a chart, it was movement, a slow, graceful drift through our corner of the galaxy, like a feather carried by invisible wind. If you imagine it now, you can almost see it, far beyond the blue halo of our atmosphere gliding against the black. There's no sound in that silence, only the gentle hum of creation. And down on Earth, the observers stared through their lenses, tracing its faint arc with fingertips on glass, half aware that they were witnessing a small chapter in something enormous. Somewhere in the darkness, a data stream continued to flow. Each pixel of light was another whisper from that traveler. Every observation widened the mystery. The next few weeks became a quiet race against time. 3I Atlas was already sliding away from the sun, and each clear night mattered. Across the world, telescopes turned toward the same point of sky, a soft, shifting smear that refused to behave like anything familiar. Some nights the data would line up neatly, showing the classic signs of a comet, a hazy coma, a suggestion of a tail, faint signatures of cyanide and carbon monoxide. On other nights the pattern scattered, as if the object were changing its skin. The brightness fluctuated more than the models allowed. Its gases didn't outflow evenly. It seemed to breathe. The first detailed spectra came from Mauna Kea, the big telescopes on the island's summit where the air thins and the stars burn clear. A researcher named Lena Torres, who had spent her career studying the chemistry of distant comets, leaned close to the monitor that night. The data scrolled in thin, luminous lines, the wavelengths like heartbeat traces. Something inside her went still. It wasn't just the usual carbon compounds. There were traces of something denser, silicates that shouldn't have survived the heat of any young star's birth cloud. She whispered the numbers aloud, as if saying them would make them make sense. The technician beside her just shook his head. "What is it?" he asked. "I don't know," she said, almost softly enough that the word disappeared into the hum of the cooling fans. That answer became the refrain of the season. Every new observation added precision, but not clarity. The orbital path was calculated again and again, and still it pointed back to nowhere. Not to any nearby stellar nursery, not to any debris belt. Just a direction in space, cold and blank. When a discovery like this begins, excitement lives in the lab. But when it lingers, when the mystery refuses to shrink, it begins to seep outward. A small community of amateurs started following the nightly updates posted online. They compared the images, noticed tiny differences, traced the bright core that seemed to twist in shape. Some began to say the obvious thing out loud, though only half seriously. What if it isn't a comet at all? Most scientists ignored the chatter. They'd heard it before, every time a telescope caught something strange. Yet even the professionals could feel the strangeness in their bones. The orbit was perfectly hyperbolic. 3i Atlas would never return, but its velocity didn't quite fit the models. It wasn't moving fast enough to account for the gravitational sling it must have survived to reach us. It was as if some invisible hand had slowed it down. The phrase "the worst theory" first appeared on a private astronomy forum. Someone posted a composite image, frames stacked from a dozen observatories, and asked a joking question. "So what's the worst theory we can come up with for this one?" The replies came fast: alien probe, derelict engine, shattered world seed. All of them half in jest, half in fascination. The nickname stuck. From then on, every update thread was tagged worst theory. It was easier to laugh than to admit that none of the good theories were working. Meanwhile, Lena kept watching. She began to notice faint asymmetries in the coma, tiny filaments of dust that curved not with the solar wind, but against it. It made no sense. She checked the calibration again, then sat in silence as the data kept insisting. She started writing in her notebook late at night, lines that drifted between calculation and confession. "If light could dream," she wrote once, "it would dream in shapes like this." Outside, the world went about its ordinary rhythm: traffic lights, ocean waves, distant storms. Inside the observatory, people spoke in low voices, like keeping the noise down might keep the mystery from scattering. At dawn, when the sky faded from indigo to grey, Lena stepped outside. The air smelled of salt and cold metal. Overhead, the stars dissolved one by one until only Venus remained. Somewhere up there, still faintly visible to the machines, 3i Atlas continued its unhurried flight. She tried to picture its surface, a frozen crust pitted by eons of radiation, faint gases leaking like whispers from invisible seams. The sunlight that touched it had traveled 93 million miles, yet the ice it struck had been asleep for longer than our planet's continents had existed. In that thought there was both awe and a kind of peace. The universe, she realized, doesn't owe us tidy answers. It only offers moments like this, fleeting encounters with something older and stranger than imagination. The next report she sent to the consortium began with a single sentence. The object remains anomalous, but stable. It was the calmest way she could phrase what she truly felt, that 3i Atlas was quietly rewriting her idea of what a comet could be. As weeks turned into months, the visitor grew fainter. The Earth's orbit carried us away, and the signal thinned. Some observatories switched focus to nearer targets. Funding cycles moved on. But a few watchers, Lena among them, kept the nightly vigil. The images grew noisier, the dots smaller, the tail more diffuse. Yet every faint frame still seemed to say, "Look again." If you close your eyes now and imagine that speck gliding through the dark, you might sense what they felt, the hush of deep space pressing against the glass, the slow turning of the dome, the gentle click as another exposure begins. Each photo another heartbeat, each photon another question that no one could quite answer. And somewhere in that silence, the worst theory kept growing, not as fear, but as wonder. Because sometimes the most unsettling thought of all is also the most peaceful one. That the universe still holds secrets too vast to name, and that we, fragile and curious, are allowed to witness them for a moment before they drift away. By the time autumn returned to the northern hemisphere, 3i Atlas had already slipped beyond the reach of smaller telescopes. What remained were the records. Long columns of numbers, spectral curves plotted in soft colors, hundreds of photographs where the object appeared as little more than a trembling point. Yet the absence of new light didn't stop the discussions. If anything, it deepened them. In the university halls and late-night video calls, astronomers began doing what they always do when the universe refuses to explain itself. They built stories out of data. Some were tidy, others stretched into poetry. Each one began with the same quiet assumption: somewhere there must be a reason. The first model was simple. Perhaps 3i Atlas was a fragment of a disintegrated exocomet, something torn apart when it brushed too close to its parent star, then thrown into the emptiness between systems. Over time, radiation pressure and gravitational nudges could have guided it here, until chance placed it on a path that intersected ours. It sounded neat, and for a few days people allowed themselves to believe it. The numbers even matched for a moment. Then another dataset arrived from the European Southern Observatory. Its measurements of the dust tail showed a peculiar drift, a sideways acceleration too small to explain but too consistent to ignore. The shape of the coma wasn't symmetrical. It seemed to pulse, to release bursts of gas in directions that defied both sunlight and physics. Someone on a conference call compared it to a heartbeat. The phrase lingered. Lena listened from her apartment that night, her desk lit by the glow of the laptop screen. Around her lay stacks of notes, hand-drawn charts, margin scribbles, half-formed equations that trailed off into question marks. Outside her window, the city lights shimmered like ground-bound stars. She muted her microphone for a moment and simply watched the screen as her colleagues argued gently across time zones. There was no hostility, only that restless mix of curiosity and fatigue that science breeds. One professor proposed that 3i Atlas might be an ancient relic from the galactic core, material older than the sun, carbon-rich and fragile, breaking apart under new light. Another suggested it was covered in a kind of dark ice, reflective only in narrow bands, explaining its inconsistent brightness. Each new idea settled like a feather on the conversation, admired, tested, and then brushed aside when the math refused to cooperate. Through it all, the phrase "worst theory" appeared in the chat once or twice, always with a small emoji beside it, a wink, a shrug. It was shorthand now for the idea that if the universe's normal rules failed, then maybe the absurd ones deserved a seat at the table too. What if 3i Atlas wasn't natural? Not an alien machine, no one serious wanted to claim that, but an artifact of some unknown process, a physics we hadn't met yet. Lena wrote those words in her notebook, a physics we haven't met yet. She underlined them twice, then closed the book gently. It sounded impossible and yet somehow kind. The universe, after all, has always introduced itself slowly. In the days that followed, data analysts began running orbital simulations backward, tracing 3i Atlas's path through the Milky Way. The results came back chaotic. The slightest change in initial velocity produced entirely different paths. Sometimes the object emerged from the direction of the Carina arm, sometimes from the Perseus spur. It was like following a trail of smoke through wind. No origin stayed steady long enough to claim. That instability led to a second wave of theories, softer ones born from imagination rather than precision. Writers and educators began to weave Three-Eye Atlas into their own narratives. One essay in a popular science magazine called it the message that space didn't mean to send. Another referred to it as a memory made of dust. The public, hearing these phrases, began to treat the comet as a character, a lonely traveler, a cosmic refugee, a relic wandering between homes. None of it was strictly scientific, but none of it felt wrong either. Meanwhile, Lena found herself dreaming in wavelengths. Sometimes she saw the object up close, a cratered surface gleaming faintly blue, cracks releasing ribbons of vapor that curved like sighs. Other nights, she dreamt of equations written on fogged glass, dissolving before she could read them. She would wake before dawn and watch the faint stars vanish one by one, her mind still orbiting that invisible traveler. When the International Astronomical Union released its summary report, the tone was measured. It listed all the confirmed facts: trajectory, composition, observed anomalies, and concluded with bureaucratic calm that further study was required. Between the lines, though, anyone could read the unease. Every line of text felt like a breath held too long. The worst theory gained another layer when a graduate student in Prague noticed something small but persistent, a spectral signature repeating at exact intervals, buried in the noise. It wasn't strong enough to call a pattern, not quite. But when she plotted it, the peaks came evenly spaced, as if the object emitted faint pulses of reflection at regular times. She shared the chart on an internal forum, half embarrassed, and titled it Possibly Nothing But Odd. Within hours, half the community had seen it. Some called it coincidence. Others suspected a rotating nucleus exposing shiny facets like a lighthouse. Still, the idea of a rhythm inside the object caught everyone's imagination. Even the skeptics found themselves listening for it, the way one listens for the ocean in a seashell. Lena thought about that rhythm often. In the quiet between her work and sleep, she would picture Three-Eye Atlas turning slowly in the dark, each spin revealing new brightness, each gleam a silent hello. The thought didn't frighten her, it soothed her. The universe, she decided, might simply be trying to speak in a language of repetition, patient, endless, tender. At a conference months later, she presented a paper that avoided the sensational and focused on the human. "We have met only a few interstellar visitors," she began, her voice steady. "Each has reminded us that we are not an island. When we name them, we are acknowledging a relationship, however brief, between our small world and the greater sea." Her talk ended with applause that sounded more like gratitude than enthusiasm. People weren't seeking answers anymore. They were seeking connection. By winter, the debate had drifted toward philosophy. Could interstellar matter carry information in its very structure? Could the composition of dust be a kind of signature, not written by hands, but by the conditions of another sun, another time? One researcher compared it to a fossil, not designed but still a record of something that once lived elsewhere. Another compared it to a prayer flag, fluttering across the void without needing to be read. The media began to lose interest, as they always do, but among the scientists the conversations persisted. They met in quiet corners of conferences, in long emails sent at midnight, in small coffee rooms smelling of burnt espresso. And every so often someone would bring up the same question, half serious, half smiling. "So, has anyone disproved the worst theory yet?" No one ever did, not completely. Because to disprove it would have required knowing what Three-Eye Atlas truly was. And by then, it was already gone. Gone, but not forgotten. Data remained, and data is memory. The computers kept their files, the observatories kept their logs, and Lena kept her notebook. On its final page, she wrote, "It came from nowhere we could trace. It behaved unlike anything we could model. And yet it left us calm." The unknown, when looked at kindly, can be gentle. That sentence became something she would quote later, in lectures and interviews, whenever people asked why she had devoted so much time to an object that would never return. She would smile and answer softly, "Because sometimes the universe only passes by once, and that's enough." If you imagine yourself lying under a clear sky now, the stars faint and far, you can almost hear that answer in the air. The faint hum of cosmic rays, the low buzz of the atmosphere, it all feels like the background music of curiosity itself. And perhaps that's what 3i Atlas offered, not revelation, but rhythm. A heartbeat of mystery reminding every listener, awake or drifting towards sleep, that even the strangest data can be beautiful when approached with patience. As the story of the visitor settled into memory, the world continued turning. The telescopes moved on to new targets, their domes spinning slowly against the night. But somewhere inside the archives, light from that distant traveler still rests on magnetic drives, waiting for future eyes. The worst theory remained just that. A whisper, a maybe, a soft smile at the limits of understanding. Yet, with every reanalysis, with each new image processed by sharper instruments, the same feeling returned. Awe without fear. And that is where the next chapter begins. Not in what we know, but in the quiet realization that knowing was never the goal. Even as 3i Atlas faded into mathematical memory, its afterglow lingered like the ghost of a melody no one could stop humming. Observatories had archived the data, papers had been published, and official interest was beginning to drift. Yet the object had left something behind that couldn't be filed away. A quiet ache of curiosity. There was something deeply human about that ache. Every time we name a discovery, we open a door to wonder. And though the object was now far beyond the reach of telescopes, the people who had followed its brief passage still felt tethered to it, not through sight, but through thought. Lena would sometimes return to the observatory's viewing deck at night when no sessions were scheduled. She would stand alone in the cool air, looking at the sky as if trying to locate a memory. The stars were pinpoints, steady and cold, but to her they no longer looked silent. Each one felt like a question, each one a reminder of how much remained unspoken. She thought often about the rhythm that the student in Prague had found, that faint, repeating pulse in the reflection data. It could have been noise. It probably was noise. But the possibility that it wasn't still stirred something deep inside her, not fear, not even excitement, something gentler. A sense that maybe the cosmos had its own subtle ways of speaking, and that human instruments could sometimes mistake whisper for silence. In her dreams, the pattern continued. She saw graphs becoming constellations, numbers unraveling into lines of light. She would reach out in those dreams, not to grasp, but to listen. And always the same thought would return before she woke. We are not alone, not because someone else is out there, but because the universe itself is awake. Outside the walls of academia, the story of 3i Atlas found new life. Podcasters, educators, and storytellers took the mystery and reimagined it in their own voices. Some told it as a parable about humility, that humanity's greatest discoveries are often its greatest confessions of ignorance. Others used it as a meditation exercise. Listeners were asked to imagine the comet drifting silently past Earth, its slow arc a reminder that not all visitors come to be understood. One night, during an outreach event, Lena was invited to speak to a group of children gathered under a portable planetarium dome. She showed them an artist's impression of the object, an uneven sphere of ice and rock, its tail stretching like a brushstroke across the dark. "Is it dangerous?" one of them asked. "No," she said, smiling. "It's just passing through." "Why did it come here?" asked another. She hesitated before answering. "Maybe for the same reason we look at the stars," she said softly. "Just to see what's there." That answer seemed to please them. The children leaned back, watching the projection as if the ceiling above truly opened into space. Their breathing slowed, their eyes wide with that perfect mixture of awe and comfort that only childhood still remembers. The feeling that everything mysterious is still safe. Later that evening, when the lights came back on and the families drifted out, Lena lingered near the projector. The image of the comet had faded from the dome, but she could still feel it there, hovering in imagination. She realized then that perhaps that was where such mysteries belonged, not just in data, but in the quiet between thought and dream. Months passed. The worst theory became a running joke among research circles, but the phrase had evolved. It no longer meant the outlandish or absurd. It had come to symbolize humility, the acknowledgement that every elegant equation eventually meets its limit. When you look too long into the unknown, the mind starts filling in the blanks with poetry. And maybe that's not a failure of science, but its continuation. A team from Japan later revisited the spectral data using a new noise reduction algorithm. They discovered something subtle in the infrared range, traces of compounds that didn't quite match the usual cometary catalogue. Silicate dust mixed with an unusual ratio of iron and carbon, forming a kind of matte texture. It wasn't impossible, just rare. But it hinted that 3I Atlas may have formed around a star much older and redder than our sun, perhaps one long dead. That thought brought with it a quiet melancholy, as though the traveler were carrying the ashes of its home system on its back. The discovery spread quietly through the community. People didn't call press conferences or make grand claims. Instead, they spoke in emails, calm and reverent, like archaeologists unearthing a fossil of something they couldn't name. Lena read the paper late one evening, the pale blue light of the screen reflecting in her eyes. When she reached the conclusion, she whispered to herself, "It came from a dying star." The words sounded almost like a lullaby. She imagined it, that lonely fragment drifting for millions, maybe billions of years, crossing the silent void where no light travels easily. It had seen no sunrise, no orbit, only distance. And somehow, by chance or by gravity's soft pull, it had brushed past Earth's tiny world, just long enough for us to notice before it went on its way again. The worst theory, she realized, was not about fear or alien intent or hidden messages. The worst theory was the quiet one, that it meant nothing at all, that we were simply witnesses to a coincidence so perfect it felt divine, and yet somehow that thought didn't diminish it. It made it more beautiful. To exist in a universe where such coincidences are possible is to live in constant wonder. To know that among countless specks of dust and frozen fragments, one found its way close enough for us to glimpse just once is to feel both small and infinite. As months turned to a year, 3I Atlas receded completely. Its last light curve looked almost like a heartbeat fading on a monitor. A final pulse of brightness before silence. In that silence, humanity returned to its routines, but not unchanged. Somewhere, someone still studies the data. Somewhere else, a new telescope waits to catch the next traveler. And perhaps, years from now, another faint dot will appear, and a new generation of dreamers will look up, remembering the one that came before. Lena no longer worked nights at the observatory. She had moved into teaching, guiding younger minds through the mathematics of celestial motion. Yet, every so often, she would pull up the archived images of 3I Atlas. The faint tail, the pale blur, the irregular core, all of it still there, frozen in digital starlight. She would let herself drift into that silence again, her breathing slowing, her mind easing into the rhythm of cosmic time. And as she watched, she would think about the children in the planetarium dome, their small faces glowing under a projection of stars. They had asked her why the comet came here. Maybe, she thought now, the better question was why we were looking. Perhaps we search because the act of looking is its own kind of belonging. In the vast, indifferent dark, to simply notice something, to name it, to listen to it, to wonder about it, is the purest form of care. And so 3i Atlas passed beyond our reach, leaving behind not fear, not answers, but quiet companionship. A reminder that mystery itself can be gentle, that not all enigmas demand solving, and that sometimes the most scientific act of all is to rest in unknowing. If you close your eyes now, imagine that traveler still drifting, somewhere far beyond the sun's faint pull. It doesn't hurry. It doesn't fade. It just moves, slowly, endlessly, across the deep, where time itself feels like breathing. And as you breathe with it, in and out, maybe you'll sense what Lena felt. That strange, serene comfort of realizing the universe is vast, but never lonely. There's a moment that comes after every discovery. A hush where excitement begins to settle into reflection. For the 3i Atlas, that hush arrived when the last raw data had already been processed, and what remained were the images, thousands of them. Across screens and archives, they waited like tiny portals into a single moment in time. Each photo, each frame, was a message from a night sky that no longer existed. Photons that had traveled for millions of miles, struck the frozen surface of a passing traveler, and continued onward until they landed on glass, on sensors, on human eyes. It was in those images that the mystery truly took root. Lena had always preferred the stills to the graphs. Numbers could describe, but pictures could whisper. When she opened the folders labeled Final Processed, she felt the same quiet awe she used to feel as a child, turning the pages of star atlases in her grandfather's study. The difference was that this time the stars were hers. The first thing that stood out was how alive the object looked. In every exposure, even separated by hours or days, it seemed to shift personality. Sometimes the coma stretched long and thin, like a silver veil caught by invisible wind. Sometimes it billowed outward, almost circular, as if sighing. There were moments when the tail seemed to disappear altogether, leaving only a faint core that looked, if you stared too long, almost like an eye. Of course, Lena knew it wasn't an eye, but science doesn't forbid wonder. It only asks that you acknowledge the difference. She began cataloguing patterns, the changes in brightness, the minor distortions that appeared between wavelengths, the edges that refused to stay sharp. Over time, she realized that none of the images could truly be aligned. Even when you corrected for motion and rotation, something within the object seemed to shift itself subtly, as if no two exposures ever captured the same face. Some of her colleagues dismissed it as atmospheric distortion or sensor drift. But Lena wasn't convinced. It's not the equipment, she wrote in her notes. It's the comet. It's restless. That word stayed with her, restless. It didn't mean alive, not in the way we think of life, but it carried a similar tenderness. To imagine restlessness in an object older than any human word was to sense the slow poetry of physics itself. She decided to create a time lapse, a sequence of every clear image stitched together across weeks. It took her nights to process, correcting exposures, balancing contrast, removing cosmic noise. And when she finally pressed play, something happened that no still frame could have captured. The object didn't just move, it shifted, almost breathed. The coma expanded and contracted with strange grace, not in response to sunlight, not in rhythm with rotation, but in something else, a pulse that no formula could predict. Watching it, she felt the oddest sensation, as though the universe was blinking slowly and kindly through the lens. The next morning, she shared the sequence with a few close colleagues. They watched in silence, the looping animation reflected in their eyes. When it ended, no one spoke for several seconds. Finally, a quiet voice in the room said, "It looks like it's listening." They laughed softly after that, not out of mockery, but because the sentence felt truer than it should have. The idea spread in whispers. A few journalists caught on to it, turning the time-lapse into a small online sensation. "The comet that breathes," one headline in red. "The universe's slow blink." None of it was accurate, but the fascination was harmless. People like the thought of something ancient looking back. But within the scientific circles, the tone remained calm, measured. The data didn't show intelligence. It showed unpredictability, the kind of complexity that could only be understood as beauty. Still, Lena kept watching. The more she studied the images, the more she began to notice an odd visual pattern hiding beneath the obvious one. If you adjusted the exposure curves just right, faint arcs appeared in the background dust, like ripples around the nucleus, concentric and soft. They weren't random, and they weren't artifacts of the telescope. They formed a rhythm, a geometry that whispered of repetition. She sent her findings to a physicist friend in Geneva who specialized in photometric analysis. 2 days later, he wrote back, "Your rings are real, Lena. They might be density waves in the dust cloud, a kind of interference pattern. Whatever caused it, it's precise, too precise for turbulence alone." That message stayed open on her screen for hours. She reread it, her mind oscillating between calm and disbelief. Precise patterns meant process, and process implied something systemic, or something intentional. But intention in a comet was not a word she dared use. In her next presentation, she simply called them concentric anomalies. The phrase sounded neutral enough to pass peer review. Still, there was a quiet thrill in her chest whenever she spoke about them. These patterns were like fingerprints of something vast and slow, evidence that the cosmos could still surprise even its most devoted observers. She often worked late after those meetings, her computer screen glowing like a tiny moon in the lab. She'd watch the rotating models, listen to the hum of the building's air vents, and imagine herself adrift in that same silence. A single mind floating in an ocean of data. Sometimes she wondered if the object, in its long journey, had passed through other civilizations' skies. Perhaps countless eyes had once looked up, in worlds orbiting unfamiliar stars, and watched the same pale wanderer slide across their heavens. Maybe they too had whispered the same questions. Maybe curiosity itself was the universe's way of staying connected. That thought made her smile. The following week, a new set of images arrived from an infrared observatory in Chile. The last and sharpest ones before 3i Atlas disappeared into the outer dark. When she overlaid them on her previous composites, the structure of the coma had changed dramatically. There was now a distinct curve, a ribbon of light bending backward, forming what almost looked like a spiral. Spirals are familiar in astronomy. Galaxies, storms, even shells follow that pattern. Nature loves repetition. But this spiral was delicate, symmetrical in a way that suggested neither chaos nor coincidence. It was faint, fading at the edges, as if drawn by hand and then half erased by distance. Lena stared at it for a long time. She knew it could be explained. Dust jets rotating with the nucleus, outgassing shaped by heat. But none of the explanations fit perfectly. Wasn't impossible, just improbably elegant. And it was beautiful. In her report, she didn't exaggerate. She described it plainly, offered plausible causes, included error margins. But when she saved the file, she added one quiet note to the metadata, invisible to anyone but her. It looks like art. Outside her lab window, the night had deepened. The sky over the Pacific stretched wide and blank, a soft ocean of darkness. Somewhere far beyond that horizon, 3i Atlas kept drifting, indifferent to the questions it left behind. Lena sat back, letting her eyes rest. She thought of all the images she'd seen, the spirals, the ripples, the strange flickers of motion, and realized that each one was less about what the comet was and more about what it did to them. It made them look closer. It made them notice. That, she thought, might be the comet's quiet gift, to remind us that even a blur of dust and ice can invite reverence, and that wonder doesn't require explanation to be true. Weeks passed after the spiral image was released, and something gentle yet irreversible began to happen. The story of 3i Atlas drifted out of the realm of news and into the quiet space of collective imagination. It was no longer an object being tracked. It was an idea being carried. Every major observatory had now contributed its final frames. The data sets were complete, neatly archived, their file names ending in the same bittersweet note: final observation. For most missions, that would have been the end. But for this one, the images refused to settle. They drew people back in as if the object had left a magnetic trace in their minds. A researcher in South Africa reprocessed the spiral using different contrast parameters. What appeared was subtle but undeniable. Faint radial streaks radiating from the core, almost like spokes on a wheel. He hesitated to publish, fearing the ridicule that always follows overinterpretation, but curiosity won. When he uploaded the frame to the shared archive, comments began to ripple through the private forums. Could those be dust filaments? One asked. Maybe jets? Said another. Then someone wrote, half-jokingly, or maybe a signal we just don't know how to read. The comments sat there, unacknowledged but not deleted, because by now the boundaries between science and wonder had thinned. The line between hypothesis and metaphor had softened. Lena saw that post one late evening after her lectures. She had made tea, turned off all the lights except for the glow of her monitor, and opened the image again. The spiral, the spokes, the faint glowing rim, it all felt strangely deliberate. Not deliberate in the human sense, not made, but purposeful, as though nature itself had chosen to move with grace. She zoomed in frame by frame, adjusting the gamma levels until the faintest pixels revealed their gradients. The dust halo glowed faintly blue near the edges, warmer toward the core. It looked like breath caught in sunlight. She leaned back and smiled softly. "It's still talking," she whispered. And maybe it was. In another part of the world, a young astrophysicist named Arun Singh, working with the European Space Agency, was performing pattern analysis on cometary trajectories. Out of curiosity, he fed the coordinates of 3I Atlas into a model meant for interstellar drift simulations, a code designed to trace possible ejection origins based on galactic gravitational tides. He expected chaos. Instead, the simulation produced a faint coherence, a curved route that arced through space like a shallow bow. It was as if the object's path wasn't random after all, but part of a larger shape too vast to see all at once. He emailed the results to Lena, adding only 2 words beneath the graph. "Look familiar?" She stared at it for a long time before realizing why. The trajectory curve echoed the spiral she had found in the dust. The same geometry stretched across cosmic scale. It was coincidence, surely. And yet it was the kind of coincidence that felt designed by something older than thought itself. She replied with a single line, "Maybe it's the same pattern repeating." Small to large. That idea spread quietly through the community. The notion that the structure seen in the coma might mirror the object's path through space. Nature loves fractals. Galaxies and whirlpools share their curves. Perhaps this was another echo of that law, the universe speaking in its favorite language: repetition. Lena began incorporating that concept into her lectures, not as a claim, but as a meditation. She'd dim the lights in the hall, project the spiral onto the screen, and say softly, "Every pattern we find is also a mirror. We look at the stars and the stars look back, shaped by the same physics, the same desire to move, to orbit, to return." Her students would watch in silence, the image reflecting in their eyes. Some would take notes, others simply close their eyes and listen. And for a moment, the boundary between scientific explanation and wonder would dissolve, replaced by a quiet trust that both belonged to the same truth. That year, the astrophysics journal Celestial Frontiers published a special issue on interstellar visitors. Lena contributed a short essay rather than a paper. It was titled "The Patience of Light." In it, she wrote, "We used to think discovery was about finding, but perhaps it is about noticing. 3I Atlas did not ask to be studied. It merely passed by. The miracle is not that it existed, but that we were looking when it did. The essay spread far beyond the scientific community. Teachers read it aloud in classrooms. Narrators adapted it into podcasts. Artists painted the spiral, calling it the quiet visitor. The comet had transformed from an anomaly into an emblem of wonder, humility, and the fragile connection between observation and imagination. Still, the scientific questions persisted. Could the spiral pattern have been caused by volatile pockets rotating under uneven heat? Could the trajectory curvature be the effect of galactic drag or unseen gravitational interactions with small, dark bodies? Every answer created another question, looping endlessly like the spiral itself. And that was fitting, because the deeper they looked, the more Three-Eye Atlas resembled not a single object, but a conversation between certainty and awe, between what could be measured and what could only be felt. Months later, at a symposium in Lisbon, Lena and Arun met in person for the first time. They shared coffee in the courtyard, the air filled with gulls and sea breeze. He asked her, "Do you ever wish we'd found something conclusive?" She shook her head. "No," she said after a pause. "If we had, it would have ended. This way, it keeps going." He nodded, like a comet that never stops moving. Exactly. They sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that belongs to people who understand the same mystery from different sides. When the conference resumed, the session chair played a clip of the time-lapse that had started it all. The audience watched, transfixed. That slow expansion and contraction of light, that soft pulse. For a few minutes, no one took notes. It felt almost like meditation. Later that night, walking back to her hotel, Lena looked up at the Lisbon sky. It was faintly hazy, the stars blurred, but she knew that out there, beyond sight, Three-Eye Atlas was still on its way. The thought made her feel small, but safely small, as though she were part of a design too vast to worry about. She thought of her grandfather's old words, "Every light you see has already left." Maybe that was true of people too. Maybe every kindness, every act of curiosity was its own little comet, drifting forward long after we've moved on. She smiled at the thought and whispered, "Keep going," as if speaking to both the comet and herself. Back in her room, she opened her laptop one last time that night. She scrolled through the image archive, stopping at her favorite frame, the spiral, faint but perfect, captured on a cold night from half a world away. She zoomed in until the pixels blurred into soft gradients of grey and blue, until the image looked almost like smoke caught in light. And in that abstraction she saw something new. The pattern wasn't closing in on itself like most spirals. It was opening outward, endlessly. It was not a loop. It was a path. Her eyes softened. Her breathing slowed. The hum of the laptop fan faded into the background, steady and low, almost like a heartbeat. She closed her eyes, letting that rhythm blend with her own, the spiral continuing quietly behind her eyelids. Outside, somewhere beyond the clouds and the atmosphere and the reach of imagination, Three-Eye Atlas moved on, unbothered by questions, untroubled by meaning. Yet, in every heart that had looked its way, it left the same imprint. The gentle shape of wonder, expanding outward, never ending. By the time another Earth year had turned, Three-Eye Atlas was already billions of kilometers away. It no longer appeared in any telescope's log. The sky had folded back over the place where it once glowed, leaving nothing visible, not even a trace. But absence doesn't erase memory. In fact, it sharpens it. In the quiet that followed, something unexpected happened. The theories multiplied, not in the frantic, speculative way they had during discovery, but softly, like ripples in still water. The worst theory, which had started as a joke, began to evolve. It no longer stood for the absurd. It had come to represent the humility of not knowing. Scientists used the phrase half affectionately in papers, a shorthand for all the possibilities that couldn't be ruled out, but couldn't be proven either. When someone wrote, "Of course the worst theory still applies," everyone understood what that meant. We've reached the edge of our map, and beyond it lies wonder. Conferences now began including panels not just about cometary physics, but about epistemology, how we know what we know and how we react when the knowing stops. Lena often spoke at those panels. Her talks weren't about new data because there was none, but about attention itself, the art of listening to silence. The absence of new images doesn't mean the story is over, she would tell her audiences. It means the story has entered its quieter phase, the part where meaning forms in the spaces we can't measure. The first time she said that, a few people in the front row smiled knowingly. Others simply closed their eyes as though letting the words settle like dust. Outside academia, 3i Atlas had found its own kind of afterlife. Artists painted it. Poets wrote about it. Composers turned its data into soundscapes, low, humming pieces that echoed the pulse of its light curve. There was even a small installation in a museum in Vienna, a slow projection of the spiral image across a curved wall, accompanied by a subsonic heartbeat that repeated every 43 seconds, the same rhythm once found in the reflection data. Visitors would stand before it, motionless, and breathe in time with the sound. A small plaque near the exit read, "From a world we'll never know, light found us for a moment." We looked back. That was enough. For Lena, that exhibit marked a kind of closure. She visited it one spring evening, unnoticed by the crowd. Standing there, she realized that 3i Atlas no longer belonged to science alone. It had slipped into culture, into myth. Not as a legend of fear or fantasy, but as a story of noticing. She thought about that phrase again, the worst theory. The more she turned it over in her mind, the less it sounded like despair, and the more it sounded like acceptance. The worst theory wasn't the wrong one, it was the most human one. The willingness to say, maybe this isn't about us. A few months later, she was invited to contribute a chapter to an anthology titled The Sky Between Worlds. Her essay, The Comet That Taught Us to Wait, began simply, "There's a strange grace in being visited by something that asks for nothing." 3i Atlas came and went without drama, without collision, without consequence, and yet it changed the shape of how we wonder. She described how the initial panic for explanation had softened into patience, how scientists, for once, allowed themselves to linger in ambiguity without turning it into conquest. She ended with a question rather than a conclusion. If a traveler passes through our skies and we never understand it, has the universe failed to tell its story, or have we simply learned to listen differently? The essay went viral in unexpected ways. Teachers began assigning it in literature courses. A few radio hosts read it during their late-night programs. There was even a small online movement, listeners recording themselves reading her words under real starry skies, their voices slow, steady, reverent. Lena found that deeply moving. She had never wanted fame. What she wanted was connection. And somehow, the comet had given her that in ways she never could have predicted. Back in her office, the spiral image still hung framed on the wall. Its faint arcs caught the afternoon light in silver reflections. Sometimes, between lectures, she would glance at it and feel the same quiet awe she'd felt that first night in the observatory. The feeling had changed shape over time, from excitement to wonder to something gentler, like gratitude. She often told her students, "We study objects, but what we really measure is ourselves, our patience, our fear, our readiness to be surprised." One of them asked her once, "Do you think there will ever be another one like it?" "There will be others," she said, "but not this one. And that's all right. We're not meant to repeat every miracle." That line stayed with her student long after graduation. Years later, he would quote it at a conference of his own. Meanwhile, new instruments came online, larger telescopes, sharper detectors, faster data pipelines. They scanned the skies tirelessly, searching for new interstellar objects. Statistically, more were inevitable, but none, at least yet, carried the same haunting grace as 3i Atlas, Perhaps that was because the first time you truly listen to the unknown, it always feels like a miracle. Among astronomers, the event became a kind of shared memory, a reference point in quiet conversations over coffee or late-night emails. It was our generation's whisper, one researcher wrote, proof that the universe still leaves room for poetry. At a small observatory in Chile, a young team revisited the raw Atlas discovery images. They ran them through a new AI-assisted system designed to extract subpixel motion data. What they found wasn't groundbreaking, just a clearer sense of the nucleus's rotation. But one analyst noted something poetic in the report. Its motion is consistent with tumbling, not spinning. It doesn't turn in perfect cycle. It wobbles slightly and perpetually, like a compass searching for north in a magnetic storm. Lena loved that sentence. It felt like a metaphor for all knowledge, always steady enough to continue, always uncertain enough to remain alive. When she read that line aloud in one of her final lectures before retirement, her voice softened. You see, she told her students, maybe the universe doesn't want us to draw conclusions. Maybe it wants us to dance a little with uncertainty. Stay curious, to wobble. A few laughed, but most nodded. Outside the lecture hall, dusk was falling. The first evening stars blinked awake above the campus. Somewhere far beyond their reach, the traveler from another sun continued its slow drift into deeper darkness. Steady, ancient, serene. And though no telescope could see it anymore, humanity still carried its echo. In equations, in art, in language, in quiet hearts that still looked upward before sleep, wondering what else might pass our way. The worst theory, it turned out, was never about being wrong. It was about staying open. The years went quietly. Science moved on, as it always does, toward sharper images, deeper data, and new puzzles waiting to be named. But, like an old melody carried by wind, the name 3i Atlas never quite left the conversation. It appeared in footnotes, in passing references, in classroom slides, whispered not as a mystery unsolved, but as a story unfinished. For Lena, it had become something more personal. The comet had threaded itself through her life like a constellation, not dominating it, just quietly present. Even after she retired, she couldn't resist looking at new sky survey results. Old habits linger. Some evenings she'd sit by her window with a tablet, scrolling through the latest updates from the Pan-STARRS and Vera Rubin observatories. Each time a faint new object appeared in the feed, she'd feel that same familiar spark. Maybe this is another one. But it never was, and she was content with that. Retirement gave her more time to think and to listen. She started keeping an audio diary, a quiet practice, speaking her thoughts into the dark before bed. Most nights her entries were soft, slow reflections on the sky, spoken like bedtime stories to herself. I used to think discovery was about light, she said in one. But maybe it's about timing, about being awake at the right moment when something extraordinary passes by. Her voice carried that same calm rhythm she once used during lectures, part teacher, part dreamer. On another night, she recorded, "We only ever see visitors in motion. Nothing in the universe stands still long enough to be truly known." Then she paused, sighed gently, and added, "Maybe that's why the unknown feels peaceful. It reminds us that stillness is an illusion." She didn't publish these recordings. They weren't meant for anyone else. They were like the comet's spiral, quiet, ongoing, unending. Meanwhile, far away, new generations of astronomers had begun tracing what they called the lineage of the interstellar. There were now 3 confirmed visitors beyond 3i Atlas, each with their own peculiarities, none identical, all beautiful. Yet, whenever one of them crossed a telescope's field of view, someone, somewhere, inevitably mentioned the first that made them feel. At an international symposium, a young researcher presented a talk titled Echoes of the Third Visitor. Her slides opened not with graphs, but with a photograph of the faint spiral. Every data set leaves a shadow, she said softly. 3i Atlas taught us that not all mysteries are problems. Some are mirrors. Lena watched the live stream from home. She smiled, not with pride, but with a quiet, almost maternal fondness. The world keeps remembering in its own language, she thought. That's how science stays human. That evening, she took a slow walk outside. The air smelled faintly of rain. The sky was clouded, but she didn't mind. She had always believed that even when unseen, the stars were there. Their light just waiting behind the veil. She tilted her head upward anyway, as if meeting the gaze of something old and kind. For a moment, she wondered where the traveler might be now. By then, 3i Atlas would have crossed beyond the gravitational whisper of our solar system, slipping into the true interstellar dark. No sunlight would reach it anymore. Its gases would have frozen solid again, its coma long gone. To any passing observer, if such existed, it would appear as nothing more than a quiet speck drifting between galaxies. Yet to Lena, that imagined image wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. She pictured it moving through the void like a seed, unhurried, carrying stories no one would ever read, and that somehow was enough. She found herself speaking to it softly under her breath. "You're still out there, aren't you?" she whispered. "Still keeping your secrets." A gust of wind brushed against her hair. Cool and faint, it felt, for just a heartbeat, like an answer. Months later, she was invited to give one final public talk, a farewell lecture, at the university's planetarium. She almost declined. She'd already said everything she thought she had to say, but the request was phrased so warmly that she agreed. That evening, the dome filled with students, families, even a few of her old colleagues. The lights dimmed. Above them, the projection bloomed into a familiar pattern. Not constellations, not galaxies, but the spiral of 3i Atlas glowing softly in faint blues and whites. The audience exhaled together, a collective sigh. Lena stepped up to the microphone and began not with data, but with a story. She spoke about the first night she saw the discovery image, how faint the dot had looked, how fragile the thought of something from elsewhere had seemed. She described the sleepless nights that followed, the excitement, the confusion, the quiet joy of realizing that sometimes wonder doesn't need resolution. Her tone was slow, steady, almost like a lullaby. You could hear the years in her voice, not weariness, but patience. She paused halfway through, letting the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to breathe. Then she said, "We always called it the worst theory, but maybe the worst theory was also the kindest one, the one that let us sit with not knowing and still feel at peace." She told them that science is not a race toward certainty, but a rhythm, a breathing between questions and understanding. "If you listen closely," she said, "you'll notice that the universe doesn't shout its secrets. It whispers, and sometimes the whisper is enough." When she finished, the dome filled with quiet applause, the kind that doesn't break the mood. A few people wiped tears from their eyes. Others just looked up, letting the projected spiral turn slowly above them. After the lights came back on, students lined up to thank her. One handed her a small card. On it was a drawing, a childlike sketch of a comet with a little spiral tail, and at the bottom, the words, "Thank you for teaching us to listen." Lena kept that card. She tucked it into her notebook, the same one she had used years ago to record her first notes on the object's strange light. The paper had yellowed slightly, the ink fading, but the words still glowed in memory. That night, back home, she set the card on her bedside table. Through the window, she could see only a handful of stars, faint and trembling. She turned off the light, lay down, and whispered a line she had repeated countless times to her students. "The universe is not asking for answers. It's offering wonder." Her breathing slowed. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled, soft, harmless. And above the clouds, light from long-dead stars kept traveling, steady as heartbeat, older than memory, endless as thought. If you could see her then drifting towards sleep, you might think of the spiral again, how it never closed, how it kept opening outward. Maybe that was the lesson all along, that nothing truly ends, not even the faintest glow of a passing traveler. And far beyond the edge of our solar system, in the eternal quiet, Three-Eye Atlas continued its voyage, not gone, just beyond sight. Its path uncoiling through the darkness, carrying with it the smallest trace of all those who once looked its way. Perhaps in some unimaginable future, another species under another sky will spot that same faint light and give it another name. They'll argue over its nature, record its path, wonder at its beauty. And in that wondering, they'll become connected to us, strangers across centuries, sharing the same humble gaze. Because that's how the universe speaks, not in messages, but in echoes. And as Lena's breathing softened, her voice, her memory, and her comet all drifted into the same quiet rhythm. There's a kind of silence that only space can hold, not the silence of absence, but of endlessness. It doesn't press down, it expands outward. In that silence, far beyond the planets, beyond the thin boundary where the sun's light becomes just another star among millions, a small traveler continues its steady glide. Three-Eye Atlas moves now through what astronomers call the interstellar medium, a faint ocean of dust and gas between stars, thinner than any vacuum built on Earth, yet vast beyond comprehension. Here there is no warmth, no up or down, only motion. The object doesn't shine, it reflects. It doesn't steer, it drifts. Its surface, once alive with faint jets of sublimating ice, is now frozen in perfect stillness, and still it moves. In every scientific sense, it is nothing more than an object obeying gravity, a remnant of some ancient system long gone cold. Yet, if you let your mind wander, if you let your thoughts slow to match the rhythm of its orbitless journey, you might sense something gentler. The feeling that movement itself is a kind of memory. Each fragment of dust that drifts off its surface carries with it the story of where it began. Tiny signatures of carbon, oxygen, magnesium, all forged in the hearts of dying stars before our sun ever existed. Those atoms have been here before. They have been part of other worlds, other skies. The universe recycles wonder endlessly. To imagine Three-Eye Atlas now is to imagine quiet persistence, the patience of matter continuing its slow pilgrimage through eternity. Its spiral, once bright against the night sky, is invisible now, but still present in shape, like an echo that never stops fading because the air never runs out. If you could ride alongside it, if you could somehow stand on its cold surface, you would see nothing but distance in every direction. The stars wouldn't twinkle. They'd hold perfectly still, scattered like ancient fireflies. There'd be no sound, no wind, no color, only the soft pull of light so faint it might as well be a dream. And in that dream the traveler would keep moving. Long after Earth's cities fade, long after languages change and species come and go, the comet will still be out there, carrying traces of our encounter. The faintest dust disturbed by telescopic gaze, the memory of photons reflected toward us one brief summer long ago. It's strange to think of memory existing without mind, yet the universe does it effortlessly. Every particle remembers in its own quiet way, through trajectory, through spin, through the subtle scars of collisions past. Three-Eye Atlas doesn't think, but it remembers through motion, and motion is enough. When the data was first released years ago, astronomers had plotted its velocity relative to the Sun, about 26 kilometers per second. At that speed, it would take roughly 2,000 years just to cross the distance between our star and the next nearest one. Time has no urgency out here. It flows like light, constant, impartial, infinite. If you listen, not with ears, but with imagination, you might hear the faint hum of that motion, the gentle hiss of cosmic rays glancing off its crust. It's the softest sound that never was, a rhythm too long for human hearing but perfect for the patience of the stars. Somewhere back in our small corner of the galaxy, the images still rest in archives. The spiral, the halo, the faint glow. They are our way of keeping the traveler close. But out here, none of that matters. The universe doesn't archive, it continues. Perhaps that's the lesson 3i Atlas leaves behind. That everything continues, just in slower languages. In the quiet beyond, distances lose their meaning. 1,000,000 kilometers or 1,000,000,000 are the same, just steps in an unending walk. The traveler drifts past invisible waves of hydrogen, past the occasional shard of dust, past nothing at all. Its trajectory is not toward, but through. There are no watchers now, no telescopes tracking its path. But if you could see through the dark, you might notice how its shape still holds that faint, spiral memory, imprinted in frozen gas, a fossil of motion. It doesn't matter that no one sees it. The beauty of the universe doesn't depend on being witnessed. Back on Earth, generations change. Cities rise, crumble, rebuild. People look at new skies through sharper instruments, call new discoveries by new names. But sometimes, when the night is clear and quiet enough, someone will look up and think of that old visitor that once crossed our sky, and though they can't see it, they'll feel that small, ancient tug of wonder. The same feeling Lena felt, the same one her students carried forward, the same one that keeps the human heart leaning upward. That is how stories survive in the cosmos. Not as light, but as longing. In the absence of new data, imagination takes over. Artists still paint 3i Atlas in ways no camera ever could. Its frozen surface dusted in pale auroras, its path a luminous thread through infinity. Poets still write about it in soft, rhythmic lines that sound like breathing. And in classrooms, teachers still tell the story not as history, but as a meditation. That once, for a brief and gentle moment, something from another world passed by and reminded us how vast kindness can be. Somewhere deep in that darkness, the comet moves through a region astronomers call the local bubble, a vast cavity in the galaxy's gas, carved out by ancient supernovae. The radiation here is thin but warm, and the light from distant stars travels farther before fading. 3i Atlas drifts through it like a leaf through still water. No destination, no hurry. Just quiet continuation. Its nucleus is cracked now, the stresses of past heat long frozen into jagged seams. But those fractures hold patterns, spirals upon spirals, echoes upon echoes. They are not random. They are the fossilized remnants of its own breathing back when sunlight still touched it. If you could trace those cracks, they would form the same geometry Lina once studied, the same gentle curl that she saw in the images. The spiral continues, not in light but in structure. Even the ice remembers its rhythm. And maybe that's all meaning ever was, not explanation, but persistence. The universe doesn't tidy up its mysteries, it lets them drift. And in that drifting it creates something quieter than understanding. It creates peace. So the traveler keeps moving, silent, steady, unknowable. And somewhere behind it, far behind, among one small planet's archives, memories and voices, there remains a trail of words, equations and quiet hearts, still listening for echoes. Not because they expect an answer, but because listening is the answer. Somewhere beyond the thin halo of our solar system, 3i Atlas continues its silent voyage. The sun, once a blazing sphere that warmed one side of its icy body, is now no brighter than a distant star. Just one pinprick among countless others. No one watches it anymore. No signal tracks it. But that doesn't mean it is lost. The universe has no concept of lost. It only knows motion. The comet passes through regions of faint light, the glow of distant nebulae scattered by dust so old it has forgotten its own origin. In these places, time behaves differently. It's not that it slows down, it simply stretches. Seconds dissolve into centuries, and centuries feel like moments. 3i Atlas drifts within that timelessness, its every curve and scar preserved in crystalline cold. If you could look closely at its frozen surface now, you'd see the map of its history etched into the ice, the shallow furrows left by cosmic particles, the rippled texture of ancient sublimation, the faint grooves of micrometeoroid impacts. Each mark is a word in a language of endurance. And between those marks, hidden beneath layers of transparent ice, small pockets of gas still shift softly in the dark. When they escape, one molecule at a time, they create whispers of movement, tiny pushes that alter its course by fractions of degrees. That's how the spiral continues unseen. Not in light now, but in motion. The universe, vast as it is, still feels intimate at this scale. The comet's lonely drift is no more or less lonely than the turning of a planet or the orbit of an electron. Everything moves, everything circles something, even if that something is nothing but the idea of direction. In some far future, thousands of years from now, the traveler will pass near another star. Perhaps that system will have planets, or dust, or observers who look upward. Maybe their instruments will catch a flicker, a faint curve of reflected light, and someone will whisper across another sky, "Something's out there." And the story will begin again, not the same, but resonant. That's what echoes do. They never repeat perfectly, yet they always remember the tone. Back on Earth, long after Lena's time, people will still speak of 3i Atlas, not as data. Those files will have faded, overwritten by newer discoveries, but as story. Parents will tell their children about the visitor from another world that once passed through our sky and taught us the meaning of patience. In classrooms, the spiral image might appear on old digital archives, grainy and imperfect, but still glowing faintly, like a ghost of light. A student somewhere will look at it for the first time, their brow furrowed in curiosity, and feel what Lena once felt, that strange mix of awe and peace that pull toward the infinite. They'll type its name into a search bar, fall into the same rabbit hole of wonder, and begin again the human ritual of asking questions that can't be answered. That's how legacy works in the cosmos. It doesn't demand memory, it invites rediscovery. And maybe that's why the story of the worst theory still feels alive. It was never about being wrong. It was about learning to see uncertainty as beauty, to find calm not in conclusions, but in the spaces between them. If you listen closely, you can still hear its rhythm. Not the literal hum of particles or the vibration of light, but the deeper pulse, the steady, endless tempo of existence itself. The same rhythm that moves galaxies, that turns tides, that slows our breathing as we drift toward rest. It's the rhythm that says everything continues. Imagine it now, the traveler, gliding through a sea of stars, each one a possible sunrise it will never see. Around it, nothing moves fast. Everything unfolds at the pace of eternity. A single atom of dust drifts by, collides softly and drifts away again. The impact changes nothing, yet in the physics of the universe it changes everything. Even the smallest contact alters the future, however slightly. And that's enough. Perhaps that's what the scientists, the dreamers, and the listeners all felt when they spoke of the worst theory. Not despair, but surrender, the gentle acceptance that the universe will always be bigger than the maps we draw of it. Lena once said, "Wonder is the only constant." Her words have become a kind of mantra among those who study the stars. They appear in footnotes on lab walls, even whispered in control rooms during long, sleepless nights of observation. And each time they're repeated, they carry her calm tone, unhurried, grounded, full of quiet trust in the unknown. If she could see the traveler now, she might smile. Not out of pride, but recognition. 3i Atlas has become exactly what it was always meant to be, a continuation. A moving point in the infinite, unmeasured conversation between matter and meaning. Somewhere deep in its ice, sunlight from our system is still trapped. Photons that struck its surface decades ago absorbed and frozen into the crystalline lattice. They'll remain there for eons, tiny memories of a world it once passed. And when it finally reaches the next star, when those photons are released again in faint warmth, they'll carry a fragment of us, however small, across that impossible gulf. In that way, perhaps we are all travelers too, drifting between moments, between questions, between lights that will outlast us. So as the story of Three-Eye Atlas comes to its gentle close, the silence doesn't feel empty. It feels full. Full of everything we still don't know and everything we've quietly accepted not to know. The traveler keeps going. The spiral keeps opening. The light keeps moving. And somewhere, a listener, maybe you, keeps breathing in time with it, slower now, easier now, as the edges of thought begin to blur. This is how science becomes lullaby. Out there in the dark, a fragment of another world continues on its path, and down here, in the warmth of your own, you can rest, knowing it's still moving. Proof that not everything vanishes when unseen. Some things simply go on. And maybe, before sleep takes hold, you can imagine it one last time. A small body of ice and rock, drifting between the stars. No destination, no fear. Only motion, steady and kind. And then, like the last breath of a star before dawn, the image fades. The Atlas, still traveling, still whispering. And you, still listening, softly, peacefully, into the quiet beyond.